In a bustling, high-tech hospital in an upscale suburban community, St. Mary's General was a place that stood tall as a symbol of medical excellence. But when Angela Parker, an exceptionally skilled black nurse, stepped into its corridors, she was oblivious to the web of prejudice that lurked beneath the hospital's shiny surface. Little did she know, a seemingly ordinary patient named Thomas Edwards, who was silently observing from his hospital bed, held more power than anyone could have imagined. What would unfold during Angela's time at St. Mary's was nothing short of transformative. Her presence would ignite a battle against deep-seated biases, while Mr. Edwards, hiding behind the guise of a simple patient, held the key to a reckoning that would change the hospital's future. But before we dive into this dramatic story, don't forget to comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy tales filled with twists and a heavy dose of justice, make sure to subscribe. Now, let's begin. The hospital was spotless, the floors so polished you could see your reflection, and the sterile scent of disinfectant was overwhelming. Angela Parker stood at the entrance, clutching her bag tightly. This was her first day. The weight of expectations pressed down on her as she stepped into the nurse's station. Immediately, the lively chatter among the staff dwindled. Eyes darted her way only to be quickly averted. Conversations turned to hushed whispers, leaving Angela standing there, feeling like an outsider before she'd even spoken a word. Determined to remain composed, she cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Can you direct me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse looked up, her icy blue eyes scanning Angela from head to toe. She forced a smile. "Down the hall, third door on the right," she said, her tone clipped. There was no warmth in her words, only polite detachment. Angela nodded and headed down the hallway, feeling the weight of every set of eyes on her back. The click of her shoes echoed through the quiet, almost eerie atmosphere. As she approached the door, a tall man in a pristine white coat stepped out of a nearby room. His salt and pepper hair and serious expression gave him an air of authority. Angela's heart quickened. This was her chance to make a good impression. "Good morning, doctor," Angela said, offering a warm smile. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. It's a pleasure to meet you." The man's steel-gray eyes met hers briefly before he looked her up and down with disinterest. "Dr. William Greaves," he said curtly. "I hope you're ready to meet our high standards here at St. Mary's." Without waiting for a response, he brushed past her, leaving Angela standing alone with her hand still outstretched. She exhaled slowly, letting her hand fall to her side. It was clear from the start that her time here wouldn't be easy. But Angela wasn't one to back down. She had faced challenges before, and this would be no different. Angela's first day passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings, and quick introductions. But it wasn't long before she noticed how the other nurses interacted with her. Every time she entered a room, conversations would halt, only to resume in whispers when she walked away. Small talk was brief, with cold, polite responses. It was clear she was being kept at arm's length, and it stung. As she was leaving for the day, mentally and emotionally drained, she overheard two nurses talking near the lockers. "Did you see the new hire?" one whispered. "Yeah," the other replied, her tone dripping with disdain. "I don't know why they hired her. This isn't exactly the right neighborhood for, you know." Angela's hand froze on her locker handle. Her heart sank, but she forced herself to keep moving. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered such ignorance, and it wouldn't be the last. As she left the hospital, the cold evening air stung her face, but the pain of the words she'd overheard stung even more. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. "Hey, baby girl," her mother's warm voice answered. "How was your first day?" Angela paused, her voice thick with emotion. "It was hard, Mama," she admitted, tears pricking her eyes. She recounted the day, the coldness of her colleagues, and the blatant prejudice she'd felt. There was a moment of silence before her mother spoke again, her voice filled with the strength Angela had always admired. "Listen to me, Angela Marie Parker. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel small. You hold your head high, baby girl. You come from a long line of strong women, and you've got that same strength in you. Don't let them see you sweat." Angela wiped away a tear and smiled, the fire of determination reigniting within her. "I know, Mama. I just wasn't expecting it to be like this. Nothing worth doing is ever easy, her mother reminded her. You're going to have to fight, but you've got the strength to win. The following weeks at St. Mary's were grueling. Angela was constantly tested, given the hardest patients, and scrutinized for every move she made. One such patient was Mr. Johnson, an elderly man known for his racist outbursts. He had already driven 2 nurses to tears, but when Angela was assigned to him, she braced herself for the worst. "I don't want no colored nurse touching me," he spat as soon as she walked into his room. Angela took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm. "I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing, Mr. Johnson." She endured his slurs in silence, performing her duties with the utmost care and professionalism. When she finally stepped out of the room, she found Dr. Greaves waiting for her, an amused smirk on his face. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker? We heard quite the commotion." Angela met his gaze evenly, refusing to rise to his bait. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable. Is there anything else you need from me?" Dr. Greaves narrowed his eyes, clearly irritated by her composure. "Just make sure you don't make any mistakes. We wouldn't want any complaints, would we?" As he walked away, Angela felt the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. Every day was a battle, but her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let them see you falter." The turning point came with the arrival of a new patient. Mr. Thomas Edwards had been admitted after a skiing accident, both arms broken. There was an unusual buzz of activity around his room. He was clearly someone important, though Angela didn't know exactly who. "Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves said, barely concealing his disdain, "you're assigned to Mr. Edwards in room 412. Give him the best care. He's a VIP." Angela nodded, suspecting this was yet another test. As she entered the room, she was met by the sight of a middle-aged man lying in bed, his arms in casts. Despite his injuries, there was an unmistakable air of authority about him. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela greeted him warmly. "I'm Nurse Parker, and I'll be taking care of you." Mr. Edwards looked up at her with sharp, assessing eyes. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," he replied, his voice steady. "I appreciate your care." Unlike other patients, there was no hint of condescension or prejudice in his voice. Over the next few days, Angela found herself spending more time with Mr. Edwards, and their conversations deepened. He asked her about her work, her background, and her experiences at the hospital. Angela sensed that he wasn't just a regular patient, but she couldn't quite place why. It wasn't long before she overheard a conversation outside his room. "I don't trust her with a VIP like Edwards," one nurse whispered. "Who knows what she might do?" Angela's hands trembled as she changed Mr. Edwards' bandages, but she forced herself to stay focused. When Mr. Edwards noticed her distress, he gently asked, "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" Angela hesitated but finally smiled. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards." As days passed, Mr. Edwards became more than just a patient to Angela. He seemed to take a genuine interest in her well-being. And during one of their conversations, he revealed something that made Angela's heart race. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I've always believed that the way a person treats those beneath them says more about their character than anything else." Angela paused, taken aback by his words. She had a feeling Mr. Edwards saw far more than he let on. Then, one day, everything changed. Angela had been asked to assist in an emergency operation, a high-profile case with several important visitors watching. During the operation, Dr. Greaves hesitated, about to make a critical error. Without thinking, Angela spoke up, suggesting an alternative approach. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. Dr. Greaves' face twisted with rage, but he followed her suggestion. When the surgery was over, the patient was stable. Angela's intervention had saved their life. That evening, as Angela sat in a private room with Dr. Greaves, he exploded with anger. "How dare you question me in front of everyone?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "People like you don't belong in a place like this." Just as Angela was about to respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his voice firm and filled with authority. "That's enough." Both Angela and Dr. Greaves turned to see Mr. Edwards standing in the doorway. His presence was commanding, and for the first time, Dr. Greaves looked genuinely afraid. From that moment on, everything shifted. Mr. Edwards wasn't just a patient. He was the CEO of one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country. He had been observing everything, and now he was ready to take action. Dr. Greaves was swiftly dismissed, and an investigation into the hospital's culture was launched. Angela's bravery had sparked a revolution, not just in St. Mary's, but across the entire healthcare system. As weeks turned into months, the hospital began to transform, with diversity and inclusion becoming central to its new mission. And at the heart of it all was Angela Parker, now serving as Chief Diversity Officer, leading the charge for change. As she stood before a packed auditorium a year later, Angela reflected on her journey. "Change isn't easy," she said, her voice steady. "But with perseverance, it's possible." The room erupted into applause, and Angela knew that the fight was far from over. But for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. What part of Angela's journey resonated with you the most? Was it her perseverance in the face of adversity, or Mr. Edwards' unexpected intervention? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of justice and change. As the applause subsided and Angela stepped off the stage, she couldn't help but feel a whirlwind of emotions. It had been a long, arduous journey, one marked by daily battles against prejudice, isolation, and doubt. But now, standing at the forefront of systemic change, she knew this was only the beginning. Over the next several months, Angela's role as Chief Diversity Officer expanded beyond the walls of St. Mary's. Her story of resilience and the transformation at the hospital had gained national attention, and healthcare facilities across the country were beginning to reach out, seeking advice on how to overhaul their own cultures. One particular moment stuck in Angela's mind, a memory from a few weeks after her promotion. A young black nurse from another hospital had approached her at a conference, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," the nurse had whispered, her voice trembling. "I was about to quit. I thought I couldn't make it in this field. But your story, it gave me hope. It reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place." Angela had hugged her tightly, understanding all too well the struggles that came with feeling invisible, unheard, and unwanted in a profession where you were supposed to help others. "You're stronger than you know," she had told the young nurse. "Don't let anyone make you doubt your worth." Back at St. Mary's, the ripple effects of Mr. Edwards' intervention were still being felt. The hospital's administration had undergone a complete overhaul, with new policies implemented to ensure that discrimination and bias were actively rooted out. Staff who had previously turned a blind eye to the toxic environment now found themselves part of diversity and inclusion workshops, mandatory for everyone, regardless of rank. Initially, there had been resistance. Some staff members rolled their eyes at the idea of change, clinging to the old ways of thinking. Angela had anticipated this. Change didn't come easily, especially when it forced people to confront their own biases. But slowly, day by day, the atmosphere at St. Mary's began to shift. Dr. Greaves had been a symbol of the old regime. His dismissal sent a clear message that the days of turning a blind eye to racism and prejudice were over. His departure had been a turning point for many of the hospital's staff. People who had previously felt powerless to speak up now found their voices. Conversations that had once been whispered in fear of retaliation were now being held openly, with staff engaging in honest dialogues about how to create a more inclusive and supportive environment. Angela often found herself at the center of these discussions, not as a superior giving orders, but as a colleague who had walked through the fire and come out stronger. She listened as much as she spoke, ensuring that everyone's voices were heard. It wasn't just about race either. Gender, sexuality, socioeconomic background, and even subtle power dynamics between doctors and nurses were topics of conversation now. The goal was a hospital where everyone felt valued and respected, from the custodial staff to the surgeons. One morning, as Angela was preparing for a meeting with the hospital's new board of directors, she received a visitor. Sarah, the nurse who had once been cold and dismissive toward her, stood in her doorway, holding a cup of coffee. "Morning," Sarah said, her voice tentative. "Thought you might need this before the big meeting." Angela smiled, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you, Sarah." There was an awkward pause before Sarah spoke again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've been meaning to apologize properly," she began, her voice quiet. "I wasn't fair to you when you first arrived. I let my own biases and insecurities cloud my judgment. I didn't want to admit that I was part of the problem. Angela's heart softened. She knew how hard it was to face those uncomfortable truths. We all have things we need to work on, she said gently. What matters is that you're here now, willing to be part of the change. Sarah nodded, visibly relieved. I am. And I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done, not just for the hospital, but for me personally. I've learned a lot from you. Angela accepted the gratitude with grace, but she also knew there was still much work to be done. The changes at St. Mary's were just the beginning. Real transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but the progress they were making was undeniable. As months turned into a year, St. Mary's became a case study for other hospitals across the country. Healthcare United, under Mr. Edwards' leadership, had adopted Angela's diversity and inclusion model, and Angela herself was invited to speak at medical conferences, universities, and even corporate events. Her message was simple. Diversity isn't just a moral imperative. It improves patient outcomes, staff morale, and the overall functioning of healthcare systems. But Angela's journey wasn't without personal challenges. As her professional life soared, the emotional toll of the past still weighed on her. There were days when the memories of those early weeks at St. Mary's, where she felt isolated and beaten down, would creep into her mind. She would think of her mother's voice, urging her not to let them see her falter. And on those days, Angela would remind herself that she wasn't fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every nurse, doctor, and healthcare worker who had ever felt invisible or unwanted. One evening, after a particularly long day, Angela sat in her office, reflecting on the whirlwind that had become her life. The door opened, and Mr. Edwards stepped inside, his usual calm demeanor intact despite the chaos that often surrounded them both. "I heard you had quite the day," he said with a smile, leaning against the doorframe. Angela chuckled, shaking her head. "You could say that. I just wish the progress was faster. Some days it feels like we're not moving quickly enough." Mr. Edwards walked over to her desk, his expression thoughtful. "Change never happens as fast as we want it to, but look at where we are compared to where we started." Angela leaned back in her chair, thinking about that first day at St. Mary's. The cold stares, the whispered conversations, Dr. Greaves' smug smile as he belittled her. "We've come a long way," she admitted, "but there's still so much to do. That's why we need people like you," Mr. Edwards said firmly. "People who won't give up when things get tough. You've inspired a lot of people, Angela, including me." Angela smiled, grateful for his unwavering support. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. I couldn't have done any of this without you." He waved a hand dismissively. "You were always capable. I just gave you the opportunity to show it." As Mr. Edwards left her office, Angela looked out the window at the setting sun. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but now she wasn't facing them alone. With the support of people like Mr. Edwards and her colleagues, she knew they could continue to make St. Mary's and the entire healthcare system a place where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. And so, Angela Parker's story continued. Not just as a nurse who had once been silenced by prejudice, but as a leader, a mentor, and a voice for those who needed it most. Her fight for change became a legacy, proving that with perseverance, courage, and the right allies, even the most entrenched systems could be transformed for the better. The following months were nothing short of transformative for St. Mary's, and Angela found herself busier than ever. She had taken on the role of Chief Diversity Officer with a quiet fierceness. And though the work was often exhausting, it was also exhilarating. The diversity and inclusion initiatives she had championed were gaining traction, and with each new program or policy, the hospital's culture slowly but steadily shifted. One of the most impactful changes came when Angela spearheaded the introduction of a mentorship program. The goal was to pair experienced staff members, regardless of background, with new hires, particularly those from underrepresented groups. It was designed to ensure that no one would ever have to feel as isolated and unsupported as Angela had during her first days at St. Mary's. The program was a hit, with employees across departments signing up both as mentors and mentees. One day, Angela found herself walking through the hospital's corridors when she overheard a conversation between a young nurse and her mentor. A senior surgeon, named Dr. Emily Clark, one of the few people who had been openly supportive of Angela from the start. "I'm just worried that I won't fit in," the nurse was saying, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've already felt the distance between me and some of the staff." Dr. Clark smiled warmly at her. "Believe me, I've been there too. But this hospital is changing, and you're part of that change. You don't have to prove yourself to anyone. Just focus on being the best nurse you can be. The rest will fall into place." Angela felt a swell of pride as she listened. This was exactly why she had fought so hard to implement the program. It wasn't just about fixing institutional problems. It was about ensuring that every individual felt seen, heard, and valued. As the weeks passed, Angela continued to see evidence of the hospital's transformation. The diversity and inclusion workshops, which had once been met with resistance, were now opportunities for genuine learning and growth. Staff members who had once been indifferent or even hostile now engaged openly in discussions about how they could improve not just the hospital's culture, but their own attitudes as well. However, Angela's work wasn't confined to St. Mary's. Mr. Edwards had made sure of that. Healthcare United, the parent company of several hospitals, had embraced Angela's initiatives, and other hospitals within the network began to reach out for guidance. Angela was traveling more frequently now, speaking at conferences and consulting with healthcare professionals across the country. Her once quiet voice had become a powerful force in the national conversation on diversity and inclusion in healthcare. But despite the growing recognition and acclaim, Angela remained grounded. For her, this was personal. She remembered all too well the lonely nights when she had doubted herself, the mornings when she had walked into St. Mary's with a sense of dread, wondering if she would ever belong. Now, she was determined to ensure that no one else would have to walk the same path alone. One evening, as Angela sat at her desk catching up on emails, she received a message from a familiar name, Elizabeth Walker. Elizabeth was the hospital administrator who had been a reluctant participant in the early days of the diversity initiative. Angela opened the email, curious. "Dear Angela," the message began, "I just wanted to take a moment to express my gratitude. I know that when we first started this journey, I wasn't the most enthusiastic supporter of the changes you were proposing. I resisted because, frankly, I was afraid of change, of losing control, of admitting that the way we had been doing things was wrong. But over the past year, I've seen firsthand the incredible impact of your work. St. Mary's is a different place now, and I can't deny that the changes have been overwhelmingly positive. The staff is more united, patient outcomes are improving, and the hospital feels lighter, if that makes sense. The tension that used to simmer just beneath the surface is fading. I'm proud to be part of this transformation, and I wanted to thank you for pushing me, to be better. I know I didn't make it easy for you, but I hope you know how much I respect what you've done. Sincerely, Elizabeth." Angela sat back in her chair, a warm smile spreading across her face. It hadn't been easy working with Elizabeth in the beginning. The woman had been defensive, clinging to the old ways of doing things, but now it seemed that she had come full circle. This was the kind of victory that reminded Angela why she did what she did. It wasn't about changing systems overnight. It was about planting seeds of progress and watching them grow. As the anniversary of Mr. Edwards' intervention at St. Mary's approached, the hospital decided to hold a special event to commemorate the occasion. It was to be a celebration of the progress they had made, as well as a reminder that the journey was ongoing. Angela was asked to give a speech, and though she had spoken at countless conferences and events over the past year, this one felt different. This was home. This was where it had all started. On the day of the event, the hospital's main auditorium was filled with staff, board members, patients, and even media representatives. Mr. Edwards, fully recovered from his skiing accident, sat in the front row, his supportive presence a constant source of strength for Angela. As she took the stage, Angela paused for a moment, looking out at the crowd. She saw familiar faces, some who had once been adversaries, others who had stood by her side from the beginning. She saw new hires, many of whom had joined the hospital after hearing about the positive changes at St. Mary's. And she saw a future, bright with possibility. "Good afternoon," Angela began, her voice clear and confident. 1 year ago, I stood in these very halls, feeling isolated and unsure of my place here. I faced challenges that at times felt insurmountable, and I questioned whether I had the strength to keep going. But today, I stand before you, not as a symbol of adversity, but as a testament to the power of change. This past year has been a journey for all of us. We've faced uncomfortable truths, made difficult decisions, and challenged long-held beliefs. And through it all, we've grown. St. Mary's is not the same hospital it was a year ago, and I am not the same person I was when I first walked through those doors. The room was silent, every eye on her. When I think about the work we've done, Angela continued, I'm reminded of something my mother once told me. Nothing worth doing is ever easy. The work of creating an inclusive, equitable, and compassionate healthcare system is far from easy. But it's worth it. It's worth it because every patient who walks through our doors deserves the best care, no matter who they are or where they come from. And every staff member deserves to feel valued, respected, and supported in the work they do. Angela glanced toward Mr. Edwards, who gave her an encouraging nod. This hospital's transformation is a reflection of what's possible when we work together, when we listen to one another, and when we commit to doing better. But our work is not done. We have made great strides, yes, but there are still challenges ahead. There are still people out there who need us to keep fighting, to keep pushing for change. And I promise you, we will not stop. A ripple of applause spread through the room, growing louder until it filled the entire auditorium. As Angela left the stage, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battles she had fought over the past year had been difficult, but they had led to something beautiful. A hospital where people were beginning to see each other for who they were, not for the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. Later that evening, as Angela stood outside the hospital, watching the sun set over the city, she felt a familiar presence beside her. You did good today, Mr. Edwards said quietly, his eyes on the horizon. Thank you, Angela replied, her voice soft. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Mr. Edwards smiled, his expression thoughtful. You were always the one leading the charge, Angela. I just made sure you had the support you needed. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, both reflecting on how far they had come. Finally, Angela spoke again. Do you think this will really make a difference? Not just here, but everywhere? Mr. Edwards nodded slowly. Change is a slow process, but it's already happening. St. Mary's is proof of that, and with people like you leading the way, there's no limit to what we can accomplish. Angela smiled, feeling the weight of his words. She knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but for the first time in her career, she felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing one hospital. It was about transforming an entire industry, one institution at a time. And Angela Parker was ready for that challenge, no matter how long it took. The days that followed the anniversary event at St. Mary's were filled with reflection for Angela. She had come a long way, both personally and professionally, but there was still so much to do. As she returned to her day-to-day responsibilities, balancing her role at St. Mary's with the increasing demands from other healthcare institutions, Angela felt a sense of momentum building. The work she had started wasn't just changing one hospital, it was beginning to ripple outward. One morning, as Angela was settling into her office, her assistant knocked lightly on the door. Angela, she said, stepping inside with a hint of excitement in her voice, there's a call for you. It's from a representative at the Department of Health and Human Services. Angela raised an eyebrow. This was unexpected. Put them through, she said, picking up the phone as her assistant left the room. Hello, this is Angela Parker, she greeted, her tone professional but curious. Miss Parker, this is Rachel Martinez with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, the voice on the other end said warmly. Not at all, Angela replied. What can I do for you? Well, Rachel began, we've been following your work at St. Mary's, and we're incredibly impressed by the changes you've implemented there. Your diversity and inclusion initiatives have been a beacon of hope for many healthcare professionals across the country. I'm calling because we'd like to discuss the possibility of you joining a national task force on healthcare equity. Angela's breath caught in her throat. A national task force? She hadn't expected to be approached on this scale, at least not so soon. Rachel continued, "The task force is being assembled to address disparities in healthcare across the United States. We believe your experience and insight could be invaluable in shaping new policies and setting the tone for inclusivity in healthcare systems nationwide." Angela took a deep breath, processing the weight of the offer. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of. A chance to make an impact beyond the walls of St. Mary's, to help shape a future where healthcare was equitable for all. But with that came immense responsibility. It would mean even more travel, more public appearances, and balancing this work with her duties at St. Mary's. After a brief pause, Angela responded, her voice steady. "I'm honored by the offer, and I'd love to discuss the details further. This is something I'm deeply passionate about." Rachel's voice lit up on the other end. "Wonderful. We'll set up a meeting with the rest of the task force soon. I'll email you some additional information, and we can take it from there. We're excited to have you on board, Angela." After they ended the call, Angela sat back in her chair, staring out the window at the skyline of the city. This was a turning point. She knew that joining the task force could open doors she hadn't even imagined yet, and the opportunity to effect real, systemic change on a national level was beyond anything she had dreamed of when she first stepped foot in St. Mary's. But she also knew that this new role would come with challenges. Balancing her commitment to St. Mary's with her new national responsibilities would not be easy. Still, if the past year had taught her anything, it was that she was capable of more than she had ever realized. She wasn't the same person who had walked into St. Mary's that first day, unsure of her place or her voice. She had grown into a leader, and this was the next step in her journey. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, discussions, and preparations. Angela was officially introduced as a key member of the National Task Force on Healthcare Equity, and she quickly became one of its most vocal advocates. She traveled frequently, meeting with hospital administrators, policymakers, and healthcare professionals across the country, sharing her insights and strategies for creating more inclusive environments. Her work at St. Mary's continued, though she had to lean more heavily on her team to manage some of the day-to-day operations. Fortunately, the hospital's transformation was well underway, and her colleagues had embraced the new culture with open arms. There was still resistance in some pockets, but the majority of the staff had come to see the value in the changes, and many were eager to continue the work Angela had started. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Angela returned to her office at St. Mary's to find a stack of letters waiting for her. Most of them were from healthcare professionals and institutions who wanted to learn more about her initiatives, but one letter stood out. It was handwritten from a former patient of the hospital. "Dear Nurse Parker," it began. "I was a patient at St. Mary's last year, shortly after you started working there. I don't know if you remember me. I was dealing with a difficult recovery from surgery, and I was in a pretty bad place mentally. But you took the time to sit with me, to listen to my worries, and you made me feel seen in a way that no one else had. I want you to know that it made all the difference in my healing process. I recently learned about all the changes you've brought to the hospital, and I wanted to thank you. You didn't just change St. Mary's, you changed my life." Angela's eyes filled with tears as she finished reading the letter. In the midst of all the big picture work, it was easy to forget that change often started with something as simple as a conversation, a moment of kindness, a small act that could ripple outward in ways you never expected. She wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in her desk drawer. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had taken on this fight in the first place. It wasn't about the recognition or the accolades. It was about the people, the patients who needed someone to see them, to advocate for them, to fight for a system that treated them with the dignity and respect they deserved. As the year progressed, Angela continued to balance her work at St. Mary's with her growing national role. The task force made significant strides, introducing new guidelines for healthcare equity, and Angela's input became instrumental in shaping policy changes that would impact hospitals across the country. Her story and the story of St. Mary's became a symbol of what was possible when people were willing to challenge the status quo and fight for a better, more inclusive future. But through it all, Angela never lost sight of her roots. She remained deeply connected to the staff and patients at St. Mary's, visiting the hospital whenever she could, meeting with her team, and ensuring that the transformation continued. One afternoon, as Angela was leaving a meeting at St. Mary's, she ran into Sarah in the hallway. The two nurses had become close friends over the past year, their initial tension long forgotten. Sarah smiled as she approached. "Hey, Chief Diversity Officer," Sarah teased lightly, her eyes twinkling with pride. "How's life as a national hero?" Angela laughed. "It's exhausting," she admitted, "but it's worth it." Sarah nodded, her expression turning more serious. "I just want you to know how much you've inspired all of us here. This hospital is a different place because of you." Angela smiled, touched by the words. "We did this together, Sarah, all of us." As she walked out of the hospital that day, Angela felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The work was far from over, but she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The challenges ahead didn't intimidate her. They excited her. With every step she took, she carried with her the knowledge that real change was possible, that the future of healthcare could be brighter, more inclusive, and more compassionate. And she was ready to keep fighting for that future, no matter how long it took.